benches were added. One view is 400 benches were added, the other view is 700 benches. Rabbi Gamliel became upset. He said, "Perhaps heaven forbid I have kept Torah from Israel." He was shown in a dream white pitchers filled with ashes. And Rashi interprets that to mean that similarly these students were not fit. But it was not true. He was only shown this in order to appease his mind. The question about permitting the students to enter became incorporated in the medieval halakhic literature in the writings of Maimonides and Rabbi Yosef Karo. While it is seen to be dangerous to teach a student of whom one knows clearly that he is unsuitable, in other cases he is given the benefit of the doubt. This story expresses something of the dialectic of communication in the case of the halakhic aspect of Jewish teaching. Laws about the time of the new moon and the correct observance of the festivals, there was far greater caution regarding the esoteric dimension. The Mishnah states one does not teach the work of creation to two students and the work of the chariot even to one unless he is wise and understanding by himself. Both the work of creation and the work of the chariot are terms relating to a body of esoteric teaching mentioned a number of times in early rabbinic literature. They form a significant element of the Jewish mystical tradition, but the warning against the revelation of this aspect of Jewish thought is clearly expressed in the Talmud. In discussion of the Mishnah quoted above, the Babylonian Talmud continues, quote, "And one does not teach the work of the chariot to one." Rabbi Chia taught, but one teaches them the chapter headings. Rabbi Zera said only one transmits the chapter headings to the Av Beis Din, the head of the law court, and to anyone whose heart is anxious within him. Some say one only transmits the chapter headings to the Av Beis Din if his heart is anxious within him. Rabbi Yosef had studied the work of the chariot. The elders of Pumbedisa had learned the work of creation. They said to him, "Please teach us the work of the chariot." He said to them, "You teach me the work of creation." After they had taught him, they said to him, "Please teach us the work of the chariot." He said to them, refusing, "We have learned honey and milk are under your tongue. Things that are sweeter than honey and milk should be under your tongue." Here we see the force of the ideal of protectionism. Even the head of the law court may not be suitable as a student of mysticism, albeit on the elementary level of a chapter headings because of his lack of inner spiritual attainment. Interestingly defined as the anxiety of the heart. The incident involving Rabbi Yosef, early 4th century, and the elders of Pumbedisa provide an example of this. Rabbi Yosef was a leading figure in the Pumbedisa Academy, eventually became its head. He was famous for his humility, which itself suggests spirituality, the anxious heart. This text shows him striving to gain as much knowledge as he could of the mystical tradition, but reluctant to impart his own wisdom to others. Continuing the discussion of the Mishnah, both the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds present the famous account expressing the contrary ideal in an attempt to communicate the esoteric, but one which ends in failure. Rabbi Akiva is described as leading 3 of his colleagues into Pardes, the orchard, a term interpreted as signifying the work of the chariot. Rabbi Akiva gives them instructions warning them of the danger they might face when they reach the visionary demand of the stones of pure marble. Nonetheless, each comes to grief in a different way. One died, the second became a heretic, and the third became a recluse. In the words of the Jerusalem Talmud, only Rabbi Akiva entered into peace and came out in peace. The message that the esoteric teaching should be reserved for the tiny elite who were capable of bearing their intensity was faithfully transmitted from generation to generation. Every student of Talmud came across this story and was duly warned of the danger. This does not mean that spiritual or even mystical teachings were entirely lacking. According to Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the popular Agadata narrative passage in the Talmud constituted a hidden form of communication of the esoteric. For this reason, he recommended daily study the Ein Yaakov, an anthology of these Talmudic passages compiled in the 16th century by the Kabbalist Rabbi Yaakov ibn Habib. And the gut of the esoteric kernel has been hidden and functions on a poetic rather than conceptual level. Later exponents of the esoteric dimension of Judaism, such as Rabbi Yehuda Eloi Betzalel, the Maharal of Prague, and Hasidic teachers such as Rabbi Shneur Zalman, utilize the Agada as a starting point in the process of the communication of spirituality. During the Middle Ages, from the 11th century onward, there was a new emphasis on the ethos of communication. The impetus for this came at least in part from the entry of the Jewish communication into complex cultural environments in which Jews encountered not only the Judaism of the Talmud, but also Islam, Christianity, Sufism, and Greek philosophy in its contemporary forms. A person's focus and level of religious observance were not necessarily static. In order to win hearts and minds, doors heretofore closed had to be opened. Thus, during the Middle Ages, in both the legal and mystical spheres, there was an increasing pressure to reveal the hidden and to open the portals of every aspect of Torah to a wider circle of society. In this context, both the halakhic and esoteric aspects of Jewish teaching were gradually made more accessible. Then, in the middle of the 17th century, there came a major setback to this process. There were two aspects to this. First, the Chelyabinsk massacres in 1648-49, as a result of which there was a general disarray in the Jewish community structure. This was followed by the Shabbatean debacle, mass belief in Shabtai Tzvi as the Messiah, followed by the bitter disappointment at his apostasy in 1666. In some ways, even worse was the aftermath, in which a small band of the faithful preserved their belief in Shabtai's messianic role. The reason for his apostasy, they claimed, was his courageous descent into the lower level of impurity, in order to rescue from their divine sparks which were needed to complete the process of redemption. Some of Shabtai's adherents followed him along this dangerous path, converting to Islam, or to a lesser degree deliberately breaking certain commandments of the Torah. In the middle of the 18th century, a similar but even more sinister movement began around the figure of Jacob Frank, who converted to Christianity and attempted to persuade the church to have the Talmud burned. There was also clandestine groups with Shabbatean tendencies. Understandably, there was a widespread atmosphere of suspicion. Rabbi Yochanan Eibeshitz, a leading rabbi of Germany, was accused by his contemporary Rabbi Yaakov Emnem of being a secret Shabbatanian. It comes as no surprise that the dangers of which the Talmud warned were now remembered. The broad communication of esoteric teachings were halted. Study of Kabbalah was restricted to a small elite of approved scholars, such as the member of the Brody Clause, an advanced study house adjoining the main synagogue of the town. While a number of ethical tracts, which included some Kabbalistic concepts, were published, works such as Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kednover's Kava Yosher, and in general the ethos of protectionism, came to the fore. This may also have affected study of the legal aspect of the Jewish teaching. The general focus in this field in the 18th century was an abstruse Talmudic commentary and supra-commentary and highly complex response to literature. These together constituted a medium of discourse for scholars or budding scholars. The open style of communication of the legal works of Maimonides or the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Joseph Karo was a thing of the past. True, there were popular halakha compendia, such as the Yiddish Alev Tov, the Good Heart, which was printed many times during the 17th and 19th centuries, the forerunner of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, but there was no apparent path from this to the subtle discussions of the Talmud commentators or the responsa. The doors from level to level within Jewish society were being closed. Although there was a proliferation of publishing of popular works, these can be seen as ratifying the hard lines of stratification of society. The communications ethos is characterized by the leading scholars speaking directly to everyone, even to the man in the street, as was the case with Rashi, Maimonides, and Rabbi Joseph Karo. By contrast, in an atmosphere of protectionism, he withdraws to a narrow circle of peers, and only lesser figures, unknown except as populars, assumed the task of addressing the masses. Chassidicism constituted a reemergence of the communications ethos, the attempt to open doors. One of the problems facing historians today is the definition of the distinction between the Kabbalists and the Hasidim. And one of the collections of teaching attributed to Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, who died in 1772, the distinction is defined in terms of the attempt to open the doors which interpose between the individuals and the Almighty. The Kabbalist approaches with keys to unlock the doors, and the inference is that while he may have many keys, eventually he will reach a door which is closed and which he has no key. The Chassid, however, comes like a thief who can break down any door. His weapon is inner humility and selflessness. This Chassidic power to open doors between man and the Almighty is also a power to open the doors between the Almighty and man, as well as those between man and his fellow. The central characteristic of early Hasidim was the goal to communicate the inner teachings of the Torah. The aim of the early Hasidic leaders, unlike that of the Kabbalists who preceded them, was not an elitist communication, a community of scholars of mystic text, nor of ecstatic enthusiasts. The attempt of Hasidism, as expressed in a variety of early sources, was the communication of spiritual perception and an attainment to the broad membership of Jewish society, whether scholars or ordinary people. This goal had a messianic significance, as was stated in the famous letter by Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, addressed to his brother-in-law, describing a visionary experience of an ascent of the soul which he met the Messiah. I asked the Messiah, "When will you come?" He answered me, "Through this you will know, when your teachings are publicized and revealed in the world, your fountains will be spread to the outside. That which I have taught you and which you have grasped, and they will be able to make unifications in a sense like you." I was surprised at this and was greatly pained at the length of time necessary for this to be achieved. This experience defines the unique quality of the Baal Shem Tov. His life expressed the ideal of communication through stories, melodies, and esoteric teachings. During the second and third generations of Hasidim, the communications ethos became more clearly defined. It was particularly espoused by the Chabad branch of the movement, founded in White Russia by Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi, who passed away in 1812. While in other schools of Hasidism, the goal of communication of spirituality was achieved mainly through personal contact with the Hasidic leader, and Chabad emphasis was also placed on direct study of mystical teachings, the writings and oral discourses of Rabbi Shneur Zalman and his successors. This was not merely an attempt to popularize Kabbalistic texts. There was a vast difference between the latter and the Chabad teachings based on those of the Baal Shem Tov, which functioned as a kind of translation of esoteric concepts into terms to which the ordinary person could relate. In the second generation of Chabad, one can see the clear attempt to communicate essentially spiritual and even esoteric teachings to the full gamut of society. Rabbi Dov Ber, the son and successor of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, wrote teachings for different kinds of follows, from highly complex manuals of contemplation for the man of stature to a work in Yiddish for those ignorant of Hebrew, including women. He even compiled a tract based on the Chabad teaching, was translated into Russian and given to a non-Jewish nobleman. Here we see the full range of the Jewish communications ethos, which ultimately, through the 7 Noahide laws, embrace all of mankind. The expression of the communication ideal was not a simple process. From the 1770s and even earlier, there had been opposition to Hasidim from the Misnagdim. There was a number of different aspects to this, but a key issue was concern about the communications ethos. The fact that scholars of mysticism of the rank of the Baal Shem Tov or the Mezritch or Maggid should give any access to ordinary people was considered disturbing. Hasidim broke through the doors which many 18th century Kabbalists, such as Rabbi Eliyahu Gaon of Vilna, believed should be kept firmly shut. It was precisely in this process of opening doors that one sees the power of Hasidism for the modern world. The power lies in the Hasidic teaching themselves. Rabbi Isaac Luria expressed the problem very clearly. If the communication process takes place too quickly or in an uncontrolled way, the result is disaster. His teachings expressed in Kabbalistic form the careful process of tikkun, literally repair, in which the infinite enters the infinite without harm. The subtleties of this process are explored in Hasidic thought, and particularly in that of Chabad. The hundreds of volumes of Chabad discourses and teachings which have been so far been published constitute a full theoretical and practical system of how to achieve this process on every level, mapping out the dangers and clarifying the obscure. Of particular significance are the 80 or so works by the present Lubavitcher Rebbe, which in the form of discourses, sichos, talks, commentaries, and letters focused a vast theoretical resource of Chabad on the specific issues of our time. This is not simply a luxury which we might feel we can do without. When the Hasidic movement began, it was already clear that drastic steps were necessary in order to preserve the very life of Jewish people. We have seen in our own century the horrific course of history as it rolls out without guidance, crushing everything in its wake. The essence of Judaism, the wholesome path to relate with the spiritual life, is urgently needed by all man. In the last 40 years, we have seen the widespread effect of the application of the communication ideal in terms of what is called outreach, which in reality is the breaking of the barrier between different sectors of Jewish society, between the Jews and his or her heritage. Another facet of the same ideal concerning the inner breakthrough which can take place inside the individual, the discourse of the Hasidic teaching, or a Verbringen. That unique mode of Hasidic communication discloses another level of reality, which makes the ordinary perceived levels of Judean life make it possible. The natural next step, then, which which even the die-hard rationalist, the account of history will understand, to open the door which is here to have been closed and enter together the age of redemption. Hopefully that will be very soon. Thank you very much. Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Delmar Chabad Center, and today we're going to be talking about the Festival of Lights, or Chanukah. Now, of course, most people know about Chanukah, and they see signs up in the malls and the shopping areas, or it's even on your calendars, even the secular ones I'm talking, not even surely the Jewish calendars, and they say today is Chanukah, and you will see signs all over, the season's greetings, and you see Happy Hanukkah cards in the gift stores, in the aisles of the stores. But most people don't know about the idea of what Hanukkah is. Now, Hanukkah comes around the same time as Christmas, so many people come over to me. I'm sure people have, viewers also have this false notion that say, well, it's the Jewish version of Christmas because it comes around the same time. Well, this is a false notion because, of course, Hanukkah came, as we will see in the story about Hanukkah, a few hundred years beforehand. But there really isn't that much of a connection between the two holidays, only that they do come around the same season, same time of the year, and they do have a connection of giving presents, which we'll talk about the reason for that on Hanukkah also in 1 minute. And besides that, the history is really totally different. So without further ado, let's get into it, the history of Hanukkah. Under Syrian rule, it was in the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem nearly 22 centuries ago that the event took place, what we commemorate each year as Hanukkah time. The Jewish people had returned to the land of Israel from the Babylonian exile and had rebuilt the Holy Temple. But they remained the subject of the domination of imperial powers, first the Persian Empire, then later the conquering armies of Alexander the Great. Upon the death of Alexander, his vast kingdom was divided among his generals. After a power struggle which engulfed all the nations of the Middle East, Israel found itself under the sway of the Seleucid dynasty, or the Greek kings, who reigned from Syria. Just a note that I emphasize that maybe a little bit in my tone of voice, because many times we will talk about the Greek culture that permeated the Israel country at that time, but nevertheless sometimes you'll hear it's Syrian armies. So people, of course, ask me, what is it, the Greek or the Syrian armies? And this little introduction of the history of Hanukkah should explain that. That there were the Greek Empire, but it was subdivided into the Middle East, was under Syria. Now here's a beautiful little story about Alexander the Great and the high priest at that time, Shimon. This is a story from the Talmud, so it has historical credence to it. The Talmud relates that when Alexander the Great and his conquering legions advanced upon Jerusalem, they were met by a delegation of elders led by the high priest Shimon HaTzadik, or Shimon the Just. When Alexander saw Shimon approaching, he dismounted and prostrated himself before the Jewish sage. To his astonished men, Alexander explained that each time he went into battle, he would see a vision in the likeness of the high priest leading the Greek troops to victory. In gratitude and out of profound respect for the spiritual power of the Jews, Alexander was a kind and generous ruler. He canceled the Jewish taxes during the sabbatical years and even offered his animals to be sacrificed on his behalf in the temple. Unfortunately, history would prove that Alexander's heirs failed to sustain his benevolence. It's an interesting story that Alexander the Great was a kind ruler to the Jewish people. The madman. Though at first the rule of Seleucid was rather benign, there soon arose a new king, Antiochus IV, who was to wage a bloody war upon the Jews, a war which would threaten not just their physical lives, but their very spiritual existence. Over the years of Greek domination, many Jews had begun to embrace the Greek culture and its hedonistic pagan way of life. These Jewish Hellenists became willing pawns in Antiochus' scheme to obliterate every trace of the Jewish religion. The Holy Temple was invaded, desecrated, and robbed of all its treasures. Vast numbers of innocent people were massacred, and the survivors were heavily taxed. Antiochus placed an idol of Zeus on the holy altar and forced the Jews to bow before it under penalty of death. And he forbade the Jewish people to observe their most sacred traditions, such as the Sabbath and the rite of circumcision. Antiochus went so far as to proclaim himself a god, taking then Antiochus Epiphanes, the divine. But even his own followers mocked him as Antiochus Epimanes, the madman. Another side little story in Jewish history, Jason and Menelaus. His Hebrew name was Joshua, but he changed his name, as did many amongst the Hellenists, to Jason. And he offered King Antiochus a generous bribe to depose the high priest and appoint him to the coveted position. It was the beginning of the end to the integrity of the temple priesthood. The high priest Jason erected a gymnasium near the temple and proceeded to corrupt his fellow Jews with pagan customs and rude behavior. But before long, another Hellenized Jew, Menelaus, beat Jason at his own game and bought the high priesthood even with an even bigger bribe, financed with the golden vessels pilfered from the temple. Jason then amassed an army and attacked Menelaus in the holy city, massacring many of his own countrymen. Antiochus interpreted this civil squabble as a revolt against the throne and sent his armies into Jerusalem, plundering the temple and murdering tens of thousands of Jews. It was neither the first time nor the last that assimilation and strife brought calamity upon the Jewish people. The turning point. In every city and town, altars were erected with statues of the Greek gods and goddesses. Soldiers rounded up the Jews and forcibly compelled them to make offerings and to engage in other immoral acts customary to the Greeks. As Antiochus' troops tightened their grips on the nation, the Jews seemed incapable of resistance. It was in the small village of Modin, a few miles east of Jerusalem, that a single act of heroism turned the tide of Israel's struggle and altered her destiny for all time. Matisyahu, patriarch of the priestly Hasmonean clan, stepped forward to challenge the Greek soldiers and those who acquiesced to their demands. Backed by his 5 sons, he attacked the troops, slew the idolaters, and destroyed the idol. With the cry of all who are with God, "Follow me," he and a courageous circle of partisans retreated to the hills, where they gathered forces to overthrow the oppression of Antiochus and his collaborators. Guerrilla warfare. The army of Matisyahu, now under the command of his son Yehuda Maccabee, grew daily in numbers and in strength, with the biblical slogan, "Who is like thee, O God?" Emblazoned on their shields, they would swoop down upon the Syrian troops under cover of darkness and scatter the oppressors, then return to their encampments in the hills. Only 6,000 strong, they defeated a heavily armed battalion of 47,000 Syrians. Enraged, Antiochus sent an even larger army against him, and in a miraculous, decisive battle at Beit Sur, the Jewish forces emerged victorious. From there they proceeded on to Jerusalem, where they liberated the city and reclaimed the holy temple. They cleared the sanctuary of the idols, rebuilt the altar, and prepared to resume the divine service. 1 cruse of oil. A central part of the daily service in the temple was the kindling of the brilliant lights of the menorah. Now, with the temple about to be rededicated, only 1 small cruse of the pure sacred olive oil was found. It was only 1 day's supply, and they knew it would take more than a week of the special process required to prepare more oil. Undaunted in joy and thanksgiving, the Maccabees lit the lamps of the menorah with a small amount of oil and dedicated the holy temple anew. And miraculously, as in confirmation of the power of their faith, the oil did not burn out, and the flame shone brightly for 8 peaceful days. The following year, our sages officially proclaimed the festival of Chanukah as a celebration lasting 8 days in perpetual commemoration of this victory over religious persecution. Which miracle? The miracle of Chanukah was actually twofold. First, there was a military victory as a small, ill-equipped, and vastly outnumbered Maccabean army succeeded in vanquishing the assembled forces of a mighty imperial oppressor. Second, was the miracle of the one-day supply of oil, which burned in the menorah for 8 days. To the casual observer, it might seem that the first was a more significant miracle. The military victory turned the tide in a life-and-death struggle for survival and ensured the autonomy of the Jewish people for 2 centuries. Indeed, the Al Nisim liturgy, which we recite in our daily prayers during the Chanukah, makes no mention whatsoever of the miracle of the oil, speaking instead of our gratitude to God who, quote, delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure. Yet it is the miracle of the oil which the Talmud cites as a reason for our yearly celebration. Why? Even in our own time, we have seen that it is possible for a small guerrilla army to defy the odds and conquer a sophisticated superpower. But with the miracle of the oil, God showed us an unmistakable sign of His divine intervention. Only after the menorah burned miraculously for 8 days could we be sure that it was not our own courage and determination, but the hand of God which defeated our enemy. Special customs of Chanukah. Special prayers for Chanukah. During the 8 days of Chanukah, we recite the Al Nisim, the liturgy, in the immediate